who's a leading voice on AI, social justice, and higher education. She's professor of English, women's, gender, and sexuality studies, theater, international affairs, and East Asian languages and literatures at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Digital Humanities Institute. She's a faculty of the Trustworthy AI Initiative and an affiliate at the NSF's Institute for Trustworthy AI in Law and Society. In 2024, she was named the inaugural Public Interest Technology Scholar. She held a Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Global Shakespeare Studies at Queen Mary University of London and the University of Warwick in the UK. So join me in welcoming Alexa.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you, Marco Institute for Medieval and Renaissance Studies, for having me. I'm going to speak to you about AI as RenAIssance technology and to bring literary studies, particularly early modern studies, to bear on critical AI studies. And I'll demonstrate a number of reasons why this is necessary and how all these fields can benefit from this particular move in thinking about the Renaissance. So the Renaissance era, in terms of an artistic and literary movement, are very well known for the emphasis of regeneration. And of course, generative AI is a generative mechanism, right? So rebirth or breathing new life into existing data set, if you think of it that way. This is parallel to Renaissance reaction to the classical period, where they are paying tribute as well as reinventing those ideas. And further, we can think deeper about Renaissance era thoughts about disembodied identities, about authorship. Of course, this is a period before copyright law, and authorship was conceived quite differently. In fact, collaboration very often was the norm. Paying tribute to someone is seen as a move to honor people rather than, quote, plagiarize. That is not to say we should justify, the common the common conception that AI is a plagiarizing machine, and I'm not saying that, but I'm just offering these historical models to add nuance to how we think about regeneration. And of course, Renaissance era is very well known for its interdisciplinary polymaths. You can think of any number of examples. These people who straddled disciplines, in fact, disciplinary borders were not quite erected yet. It's just learning, right? Knowledge. There's also a unique understanding of technique. The Aristotelian concept of craft, technique, and technology. By this, we do not mean digital technology, but even the quill pen is a type of technology, the printing press, and how humans coexist, to borrow Anne Catherine Hale's ecological concept in her pioneering work of thinking about human and non-human entities. So for all these reasons, I think it's very useful to bring the early modern to the postmodern, especially to rethink what we consider crisis of attention has been going on for hundreds of years, with deluge of data and a constantly evolving techno-linguistic situation. A techno-linguistic situation would refer to the idea that you have language, but language would not just operate this always technicity to it, such as your vocal cord, as I'm doing right now, or digitization or the printing press. There's never linguistic situations, always techno-linguistic situation. And the age-old question, how to manage all this data meaningfully or efficiently. So none of this really is new. We take a quick look. When the printing press was invented in Europe, I brought in a large volume of printed books rather quickly. So it's the age of mechanical reproduction. And this triggered the fantasy. They were thinking of new technologies to read faster, to digest all of this. One example is a revolving desk known as a book wheel. Agostini Romilli has one such example in the book La Diverse et Artificiose Machine, 1588. If you take a closer look, this is what it looks like. So it can simultaneously hold and contain multiple books to allow the user to very efficiently compare across them. Perhaps it's a merge between close reading and distant reading. Right? That's wheel down. Earlier in the 14th century, we have a medieval example, Marcus Tullius Cicero. This is a medieval commentary on Cicero. And here you can see the depiction of a smaller version of that. It's kind of sitting on your desk, it revolves, and you have this container that looks like a refrigerator where you can store multiple copies of the books. So literary studies has always been central to thinking about technology, and now of course central to critical AI studies, because literary language is now the core logic of LLM, if not the substance. As we heard from Lauren's paper earlier, there's the problem of sign, the signifier, and the sigmoid. But of course, the gist of it is that natural language is being sold as the logic of LLM. And technical affordances, actually, on the other hand, also make literature possible. There would not be literature if we do not have technicity and technology and a means to distribute in relatively affordable manner. Say, think about novels. And so imagination is often required to interact with LLM. That is another part where literature really comes in commonly known as prompt engineering, but it actually involves imaginary ways of triggering certain kind of reactions. That, at its core, is literary. I've been thinking of GenAI as a mirage device rather than a hallucinating device. Hallucination emphasizes the agency of the machine as if it's a human entity, versus mirage that emphasizes the human viewer, because a mirage is only visible from a specific position at a specific time, right? So it's your positionality, and these two are very different. So an example is how people have been trying to jailbreak ChatGPT. If you ask the illicit topics, of course it will not give you the answer how to manufacture explosives. But if you write that in a request, talking about, let's write this as a poem or write it in the style of Taylor Swift's lyrics, out comes the answer. It's embedded within it. So again, that's literature right there in operation. And of course, in thinking about AI, we couldn't stop but think about dreams, neurodiversity, different ways of relating to the world. Shakespeare is very famous for that, as well as his early modern playwrights who were his contemporaries. Dreams are alternative ways of knowing the world. When Bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream wakes up from having spent time in the forest as an ass, he's been turned into a donkey. He's actually not quite sure if that was a dream or a real experience. Did he actually experience it? And he speaks in codes. He says, "The eye of man hath not heard, the ear of man hath not seen," which is known as synesthesia. When you stimulate one sense, you have perception in another sense. And I see this as something that AI can offer. In other words, I'm proposing in critical AI studies, we use literary approaches, literary theory. We can only treat AI as a non-human entity that produces something akin to literature because it's fiction. And so the so-called hallucination, which I call mirage, could be understood as a type of synesthesia. Let's think about our relationship to AI and our relationship to imaginative literature. So here are a couple of points. Readers of novel, they typically are thought of being engaged in a suspension of disbelief, at least in the immersive stage, before you take critical distance, before you become a critic. Now, users of AI, they very often engage in the similar mode, but without being able to pull themselves out to create the metacritical distance. They are swayed by the fictional representation of data and AI's persuasive agency. This is a well-known phenomenon where AI would double down and insist, in a very assertive tone, what is the mirage is giving you is actually factual. So in both literature and AI, there are trustworthy characters and unreliable narrators. And I hope I am beginning to convince you how much parallel there is and how it's necessary that we need to think of AI as fiction and take a literary approach. From the adaptation studies perspective further, where I study, for example, worldwide adaptations of Shakespeare, how different cultures approach the same story. If we take this perspective, we can think of AI as algorithmically adapting human-produced words to generate outputs. It's the same data set, but each time you prompt it, you get resonant but slightly different outputs, even if the prompts remain the same. In current approaches to AI, there's a problem with singularity. There's Western obsession with singularity, both in terms of authorship, in terms of purity, where it's from. I got to know who wrote it. This has been a problem. And earlier we were touching on the question of queerness. I'm actually now proposing, beyond literary studies, the theory of transless. So this is something out of trans studies. I'm using it to understand transhumanism, but also AI as a translational, as a transitory device in order to combat binaristic thinking. Now, the computation media is often said to be a binary, well, literally a binary model, not AI. Neural network, of course, operate quite differently. So, trans as method could help us build humanistic critical AI theory. So for this, we need to go to this concept called the cisgender system. It's a term coined by Marquis Bay in this book called System Failure. Basically, there is this binary structure. It is invisible to most people. That's been given to people to basically how we are believed to be able to exist. It's given to us as the world, the world as the only possible world, the world as it is. So the system emphasizes heavily a narrow notion of purity. That's how it operates. By purity, I mean, for instance, think of all the kind of both the refusal camp and the camp that is using AI as a marketing term. It's all this notion of purity, humans versus machines. Are machines better than humans? Human condition, there's no plasticity, there's no passionate in it. I take a different view, more ecological view. I believe the human condition, passionate is part of the human condition. Think of the disability theory of how is the wheelchair part of a person, part of the user, or an extension of the user. The eyeglasses, hearing aid, pacemaker, do we take any pills at all? Does that make us less human? So this narrow notion of purity is very harmful. It's not just about transgender theory where we talk about typical masculine and feminine bodies. It actually extends far beyond gender studies to think about purity in general, or the idea of natural. AI is not natural, and somehow human texts are superior. It really depends on which human you talk about, but we rarely see debates having that level of nuance. So this system, CISTEM, is perpetuating it's perpetuated through structural conditioning, because it sets up a structural condition in which people who come later, such as us, those agents, you can only act in a certain way because of that structural conditioning. It's extremely difficult to break down. And it will leave this idea, kind of obsession of purity, like the singularity I talked about earlier. It leads to notions of exclusive membership. Who is American enough? Who's a man? Who's a woman? Who is human? And so on. So you can see the slippery slope, how problematic it becomes. And when people talk about authenticity, authentic human experience. So in this system, if someone were to fail, like someone's an interloper, right? And their failure will be framed as personal problems. It's personal failure. It's never the system. And this way it can divert attention away. So this systemic purity is actually regulating more social practices than just gender. And so I use transness to refer to a broad range of identitarian practices beyond gender, practices of signification, and to think about many phenomena through a transitory lens, transitory perspectives, to say things, not just human experience or existence is transient, but actually how our social positions are transitory. It really depends on your stage of life and so on, right? And so, given that all of this is actually on a spectrum of experiences, we can begin to think of movement through or residing in or transforming social spaces. And this goes far beyond just as been established in the session earlier, right? Having more data is actually not the solution. This goes beyond diversifying AI's training data set and so on. It goes beyond hiring more women in big tech, all important topic, but that's kind of scratching the surface. It's more a temporary solution to something deeper. People's subscription to system. People's kind of this unexamined assumption about purity. So if you think about words with trans as prefix, I'm sure with all the intellect in the room, we can come up with all of those words. Actually, there are hundreds of words in many languages: transgression, translation, transient, transition, and of course, AI is a transformer architecture, and so on. So further, AI is not just transitional and transitory in the sense that it is a probabilistic prediction mechanism, but it is trans in the sense that it's not a stable. It itself and the programmers cannot trace it back to the origin and explain exactly how it comes up with this. There's a bit of lottery kind of involved. So it's in that sense, but also it is theatrical. So it's a theatrical operation. I want to kind of drive on the idea of kind of using performance theory to read AI. The word prompt. The word prompt as a performance studies person, when I first heard it, it's not prompt engineer, I'm a prompt. Oh, actor on stage. They are reacting to their prompt, situational input, a prompt book. That's what it is for me. So, and indeed, that's how it operates, right? You give it a prompt. You're going to put on an improvised performance, a show for one person. That's you. So situational input, depending on your prompt, and it's performative. You think about Hamlet in Shakespeare, soliloquy. He's pouring his heart out, to be or not to be. Actually, it's completely biased information. It's based on situational input, and of course the character has limited perspective. Dramatic irony says that audiences often know more than the character, and so forth. So AI-generated outputs should be regarded in this spirit, right? It's the same framework because it's a probabilistic associations rather than objective facts. So I think it's very productive, especially for students who think of AI as a dramatic entity and interact with it this way. Think of it like fiction. And so it is a performative tool. It is an interpretive tool. By interpretation, we mean that it can be transitory. Your interpretation today will be different from your interpretation 10 years down the road, for instance. I'm going to wrap up and revisit and expand on some of those key points and ideas during discussion. So the final point here is how AI has a remediation function. Again, it's a media performance theory angle. It's a remediating human narratives, for instance, by representing data of one medium in another medium. So what would that be? It's larger than human data set, and it's represented in the medium of conversation. That's another point that brought me to AI and early modern drama, because our experience with generative AI is largely a chat experience. Where else do you have a chat experience? In theater, dialogue-based theater. People are chatting. And it extrapolates data sets that are not humanly possible to digest, or perhaps the humans digest them in a different manner, and extrapolate that and produce a succinct conversation. And then it performs various versions of the public's collective consciousness or unconsciousness. AI is not only queer, it is trans. It makes us think deeper about what transness means beyond gender and how systemic failures organize the world that we take for granted. And to break free of this, break free of the world handed to us by tech bros, perhaps we can start by deconstructing systemic purity. Okay, thank you.
Alexa sort of, in our conversations, talked a bit more about this, but did discuss how the generative AI user is akin to a member in a theater audience, right? Hearing performed words and acting on them to kind of fill in partial speech or even flawed speech. So I guess my question for the panel is, or for us to think about, is how does oral or performed speech help us think about our relationship, the human's relationship to LLMs differently, if at all?
I thought we could also think with J.L. Austin in terms of speech acts. What kind of speech acts are all utterances with social implications that will incur social actions can we say of speech generated by AI? Of course, for Austin, and to some extent Judith Butler, temporality is a key factor and context. So this kind of, it has to be the correct ritualistic setting. Just putting your hand on a Bible in your own room and say those words would not swear you in as president. The particular date and the ritualistic context. Now AI says a lot of things, and there are people who fall in love with AI as their virtual companion, which even has caused self-harm. In those contexts, even if it's not ritualistic, AI generated speech has real effect, real social and psychological effect is leading to those actions. And so with this, what I've evoked as non-human entity in our midst that digests, non-human entity that digests human data and regurgitate them in certain form, it's really complicating the theory of speech act that we have long thought we have a firm grasp of. And now we are in uncharted territory. I think a theory of trans-performativity combining some kind of speech, the old insight from speech act will help us grasp the effect of AI generated speech. It's too simplistic to say it's not real or it's fictional. Once it's uttered, I think it can have real effect. Of course, whether AI can marry you is to be debated. But there are AI bots priests. People experiment on that, and Buddhist monks. And thinking along with translatio, we can think of the notion of repetition with a difference. How the outputs resonate, but they're never exactly the same. It's a core human function. If you ask me something, I might say the same opinion, but not exactly in the same words. Right? You come back tomorrow and ask me, and I will repeat the idea. So I was thinking about when you brought up this type of transness in an early modern context. I think a modern way to understand it is the notion of composite selves. In Western culture, because it's obsession with singularity and uniqueness, we tend to think of the boundary of ourself as the boundary of our skin, perhaps, my identity, and so on. And there's the famous notion of who is speaking those words. We don't exactly own all the words. This is beyond the Derridian notion of language, multilingualism, but also how we don't make the rule of the grammar, we don't own the language, but also we are steeped in a field of significance, so we are soaking up whatever that has come before me that we chose to be important in forming this particular self. So the selves are always composite. In trans theory, composite self. That would also lead to composite truth, not just in translation, but truths are complicated. They're always located somewhere between fiction and history. So I propose to you this composite thinking along composite.
Your breaking up of Austin is so amazing, and I'm so glad that you did it, because that's exactly right. And I love your idea of thinking of the intermediary of the chatbot interface as a performative system that gives us something that could be called a speech act. But what kind of speech act? And what you're saying is that it's a little bit like literature because it's a fiction. And it's a little bit like a composite truth because it's a distributed sample of a lot of data, although not all possible data. And the one piece that is very important to Austin and his interlocutors, up to and including Clark, that you are not addressing is intention, right? What Derrida is talking about when he says, mon vouloir dire, right? I want to tell you something. And, categorically, ChatGPT does not have that, but what maybe it has is distributed intention. And so maybe what you want to theorize is the intention as it's distributed from the user who wants to get something out and who will interpret what comes out, the many things that are in the data set, the developers, and the political economy that has created this affordance for you and asked you, compelled you to theorize it in this way.
Intentionality, because performance is typically defined as intentioned enactment of a narrative, whether it's scripted or not, and so intentionality is key. Here, you gave me a lot of food for thought, collective intelligence, but distributed and diffused, I think. There's certainly intentionality in the data set, in the user, and so we might say ChatGPT is performing intentionality mathematically, taking it all in. And
or simulating it?
Right, simulating, because we were just chatting earlier, and remember, if you're polite to ChatGPT, say thank you, you get better result.
Yes.
And why is that? So your speech act versus it's, and I think it's distilling certain kind of it's distilling what it perceived to be intentionality in the data set and trying to perform that.
Thank you to our panelists.